The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m. Jason Kruk's voice, strained and barely audible through the static, cut through the howling wind at Camp 3. I'm in trouble, can't feel my hands, vision's going. Corey Richards and Jeff Hersey exchanged a look that said everything. Above 7,000 meters on Annapurna, those words meant one thing. Someone was dying. The arithmetic was brutal. Annapurna kills 41% of climbers who attempt its summit. Everest, by comparison, claims 1.6%. At their current altitude, the air held just 1/3 the oxygen of sea level. Every breath was a struggle. Every decision carried the weight of survival. 3 experienced climbers, a storm moving in fast. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies until noon the next day, but the wind was already picking up. In 6 hours, conditions would turn lethal. The choice seemed impossible: climb higher into the death zone to save a friend, or watch him die alone on the world's most dangerous mountain. By 2018, Annapurna had seen 130 successful summits. 53 climbers never came home. The numbers don't lie about this mountain's appetite for human life. The Northwest Route, the standard path to Annapurna's 8,091-meter summit, reads like a catalog of death traps. The Dutch Rib, a prominent buttress on the north face, forces climbers across steep ice slopes where a single mistake means a 2,000-meter fall. Above that, Serac fields hang like frozen daggers, ready to collapse without warning. The terrain between Camp 3 and Camp 4 is a maze of crevasses hidden beneath snow bridges that can give way under a climber's weight. Weather on Annapurna doesn't deteriorate, it attacks. Clear morning skies can transform into whiteout conditions within hours. The mountain sits in the path of moisture-laden winds from the Bay of Bengal, creating a perfect storm factory. Temperature swings of 40 degrees Celsius in a single day aren't uncommon. Wind speeds can jump from calm to 80 kilometers per hour in minutes. Previous rescue attempts on Annapurna tell a grim story. In 2005, Slovenian climber Tomas Humar was stranded on Nanga Parbat's Rupal face for 6 days before helicopter pilots could reach him through the clouds. That was at 5,900 meters. Above 7,000 meters, helicopters struggle to generate lift in the thin air. Most can't fly at all. The 2018 season brought unusual challenges. Heavy snowfall had accumulated throughout the pre-monsoon period, creating unstable layers that avalanche forecasters described as a loaded gun. Fresh snow above knee-deep was reported from Camp 3 upward. The glacier and Serac formations had shifted dramatically from previous years, making familiar routes treacherous and unpredictable. Base camp managers tracked the weather obsessively that season. Storms were arriving earlier than forecast and lasting longer than predicted. The narrow weather windows that make summit attempts possible were closing faster, sometimes within hours of opening. Teams that had planned multi-day summit pushes found themselves racing against deteriorating conditions. This was the reality facing Richards and Hersey as they listened to Kruk's weakening voice on the radio. Jason Kruk wasn't supposed to be the one in trouble. The 34-year-old Canadian alpinist had built a reputation on technical precision and calculated risk. His resume read like a mountaineering textbook: first ascents in Alaska, winter climbs in the Canadian Rockies, and successful expeditions to 3 other 8,000-meter peaks. He approached mountains with the methodical mind of an engineer, which he was in his other life. The 2018 Annapurna expedition had followed Kruk's typical pattern of meticulous planning. 3 months of physical preparation, gear lists revised dozens of times, weather data analyzed going back 5 years. He'd studied every available route description, memorized the locations of fixed ropes, and calculated oxygen consumption rates down to the liter. The team's summit push began at 2 a.m. on what seemed like a perfect weather window. Satellite forecasts showed stable conditions until at least noon the following day. Wind speeds were predicted to remain below 30 kilometers per hour, cloud cover minimal. The barometric pressure readings from base camp indicated a stable, high-pressure system. Camp 4 sat at 7,200 meters, perched on a narrow ledge carved into the mountain's north face. It's not really a camp in any traditional sense, just a collection of small platforms where climbers can pitch a tent or dig a snow cave. The location offers no protection from wind or falling ice. It exists purely as a staging point for the final 900-meter push to the summit. At that altitude, the human body enters survival mode. Appetite disappears. Sleep becomes nearly impossible. Simple tasks like melting snow for water or adjusting crampon straps require enormous effort. The brain, starved of oxygen, begins making poor decisions. Climbers report feeling drunk or confused. Time distorts. Minutes feel like hours. Kruk reached Camp 4 at 6 a.m., right on schedule. His radio check with base camp was routine. Feeling strong, weather holding, continuing up. The words every expedition leader wants to hear. But something was wrong. By 8 a.m., Kruk's pace had slowed dramatically. His radio communications became sporadic. When he did call in, his speech was slurred, confused. He reported seeing things that weren't there. Other climbers on empty slopes, lights in the distance where no lights should exist. The first clear sign of crisis came at 10:30 a.m. Kruk's GPS tracker, monitored continuously by base camp, showed he had stopped moving. He was still 200 meters below the summit, in the middle of a steep ice face with no shelter. Radio attempts went unanswered for 20 minutes. When contact was finally re-established, Kruk's condition had deteriorated rapidly. His words came in fragments. Can't, hands, cold, vision. The classic symptoms of severe altitude sickness were cascading into something worse. Base camp manager Sarah Chen ran through the standard rescue protocols, but each option led to the same dead end. Helicopter evacuation above 7,000 meters was impossible. The nearest rescue team was at Camp 2, still 1,200 vertical meters below Kruk's position. Even if they started immediately, it would take them 8 to 10 hours to reach him, assuming perfect conditions. Traditional high-altitude rescue doctrine is brutally simple. Above 7,000 meters, you're on your own. Rescue teams can't function effectively at those altitudes. The physical demands of carrying an injured person down technical terrain while fighting hypoxia exceed human capabilities. Most attempts end with multiple casualties. The decision matrix facing the team was stark. Option 1, wait for Kruk to descend on his own, knowing his condition was worsening by the hour. Option 2, send up a rescue team that would likely become victims themselves. Option 3, abandon him and hope he somehow survived until conditions improved. None of these options offered realistic hope of success. Kruk was trapped in a place where rescue was theoretically impossible, on a mountain that had killed more experienced climbers than it had allowed to live. The weather forecast that had looked so promising 12 hours earlier was beginning to change. Satellite imagery showed a new storm system developing to the west. Wind speeds were increasing. The stable high-pressure system was weakening. Time was running out for all of them. Richards and Hersey made their gear selection in 12 minutes. Every gram mattered at altitude, but so did having the right equipment for an unknown situation. They stripped their packs to essentials: 160-meter climbing rope, basic medical supplies, 2 headlamps each with extra batteries, emergency shelter, and a single oxygen bottle they had been saving for their own summit attempt. The decision to leave behind their sleeping bags and stove felt like gambling with their own lives, but speed was their only advantage. The longer Kruk remained at 7,200 meters in deteriorating condition, the slimmer his chances became. At 11:52 p.m., 5 minutes after receiving Kruk's distress call, they began climbing. The temperature had dropped to minus 18 degrees Celsius. Wind gusts were already hitting 40 kilometers per hour, stronger than forecast, and building. The initial 300 meters from Camp 3 followed a well-established route through relatively stable terrain. But even here, in what climbers consider the easy section, Every step demanded conscious effort. At 6,500 meters, their bodies were already operating in oxygen debt. The simple act of placing one foot in front of the other required the kind of focus that, at sea level, would be reserved for complex technical tasks. Richards led, breaking trail through knee-deep powder that had accumulated during the previous day's snowfall. Each step forward required lifting his leg completely out of the snow, finding solid footing, then repeating the process. His heart rate, monitored by a chest strap, was running at 160 beats per minute, a pace that would be unsustainable for more than a few minutes at sea level. Here, it was the baseline requirement for forward progress. Hersey followed, using Richards' footsteps but still sinking deep enough that his thighs burned with each movement. The rope between them stayed taut, not because they were roped up for protection, but because the physical effort of maintaining slack would have wasted precious energy. By 1 a.m., they had climbed only 200 vertical meters. At that pace, reaching Kruk would take another 4 hours, time they did not have. The weather was deteriorating faster than predicted. What had started as occasional snow flurries was becoming steady precipitation. Visibility, initially limited to about 50 meters in their headlamp beams, was dropping to half that distance. The Serac field above 6,800 meters presented the first major technical challenge. These towering blocks of ice, some the size of office buildings, shift constantly under their own weight and temperature changes. During daylight, climbers can pick routes through the maze by reading the ice formations, identifying stable passages, and avoiding obviously unstable sections. In darkness, navigation became pure guesswork. Their headlamps created small pools of visibility in an otherwise black world. Ice formations that looked solid could be balanced on the edge of collapse. Crevasses hidden by recent snowfall opened without warning. Richard stopped every few minutes to check his GPS and compare their position to the route they had memorized during previous trips through this section. But GPS coordinates meant little when the terrain itself was constantly changing. The Serac field looked nothing like it had 2 weeks earlier during their acclimatization rotation. At 1:30 a.m., they encountered their first serious obstacle. A crevasse that had not existed during their previous passage now cut directly across their intended route. The gap was perhaps 3 meters wide, easily jumpable at sea level, but potentially deadly at altitude where coordination and balance were compromised by hypoxia. Richards tested the snow bridge that had formed across the narrowest section. His ice axe punched through the surface, revealing nothing but air underneath. They would have to find another way around, adding precious time to their ascent. The detour took them 150 meters east, following the crevasse edge until they found a section where the gap narrowed to less than 2 meters. Even here, the crossing required careful technique. Richards went first, using his ice axes to test each step, distributing his weight across as wide an area as possible. Halfway across, the snow bridge sagged ominously under his weight. For a moment that felt like hours, he froze, calculating whether to continue forward or retreat. The decision was made for him when the surface beneath his right foot gave way completely. He lunged forward, driving both ice axes into solid snow on the far side, and pulled himself across using upper body strength that was already depleted by 2 hours of climbing. By 2 a.m., they had reached 7,000 meters. The mathematical reality of their situation was becoming clear. At this altitude, their oxygen consumption had increased by 40% compared to sea level, while their available oxygen had decreased by 65%. Their bodies were burning through energy reserves at an unsustainable rate. The wind had increased to sustained speeds of 50 kilometers per hour, with gusts approaching 70. Each gust threatened to knock them off balance or tear equipment from their hands. Snow was now falling steadily, accumulating on their clothing and gear, adding weight and reducing insulation efficiency. At 2:15 a.m., Richards made the call to seek shelter. Continuing in these conditions would likely turn a rescue mission into a recovery operation for all 3 climbers. They found a small ice outcrop that offered partial wind protection and dug a shallow platform where they could wait out the worst of the storm. The bivouac lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. They took turns staying awake, monitoring weather conditions and maintaining body heat. Neither man slept. At this altitude, in these conditions, sleep could easily become permanent. At 4:35 a.m., the wind finally began to ease. Visibility improved marginally. They resumed climbing, knowing they had perhaps 2 hours before the next weather system arrived. At first light, the search began in earnest. Richards and Hersey had climbed through the worst conditions either had experienced above 7,000 meters, but finding Kruk in the vastness of Annapurna's upper reaches presented an entirely different challenge. His last known GPS position placed him somewhere within a 200-meter radius of steep ice faces and snow-filled gullies. In perfect visibility, that area could be searched systematically in 30 minutes, but visibility remained limited to perhaps 40 meters, and the terrain was a three-dimensional maze of ice formations, rock outcrops, and wind-carved snow features. They split up, a calculated risk that violated basic mountaineering safety protocols but doubled their search efficiency. Richards took the eastern approach, following what appeared to be a natural line a struggling climber might take when seeking shelter. Hersey worked to the western slopes, checking behind ice formations large enough to provide wind protection. The silence was unnerving. At this altitude, sound carries differently. The thin air doesn't transmit voices well, and the constant wind creates a background noise that masks calls for help. They established a system. Every 5 minutes, each would stop and listen for 30 seconds, then shout Kruk's name 3 times. At 6:20 a.m., Hersey's voice cut through the wind. "Got him!" Kruk was wedged into a narrow depression between 2 ice blocks, barely visible beneath a layer of accumulated snow. He was conscious but barely responsive. His eyes tracked movement, but his speech was limited to single words that came out slurred and disconnected. The medical assessment was grim. Kruk's skin had taken on the waxy, pale appearance that indicates severe hypothermia. His core body temperature, measured with a digital thermometer, registered 32.8 degrees Celsius. Dangerously low, but not yet fatal. His pulse was weak and irregular at 45 beats per minute. Most concerning were the signs of cerebral edema, confusion, loss of coordination, and periods where he seemed unaware of his surroundings. Richards had trained as a wilderness first responder, but treating altitude sickness at 7,200 meters with limited supplies required improvisation. They wrapped Kruk in their emergency bivy sack and forced him to drink small sips of warm water from their remaining thermos. The single oxygen bottle they had carried became their most valuable asset. They placed the mask over Kruk's face and set the flow rate to 2 liters per minute. Within 20 minutes, the supplemental oxygen produced noticeable improvement. Kruk's speech became more coherent. He recognized his rescuers and could answer basic questions about his condition, but he remained unable to stand unassisted or coordinate complex movements. The descent plan required solving multiple technical problems simultaneously. Kruk couldn't climb down under his own power, which meant lowering him using rope systems. But the terrain between their current position and Camp 3 included several sections where traditional lowering techniques wouldn't work. Overhanging ice faces, narrow gullies filled with loose snow, and traverse sections that required lateral movement across steep slopes. Richards rigged the first anchor using 2 ice screws placed in solid blue ice, backed up with a snow bollard. The system would allow them to lower Kruk approximately 30 meters before requiring a new anchor point. At that rate, the descent to Camp 3 would require at least 15 anchor stations and consume most of their available rope. The weather window calculations added urgency to every decision. Base camp radio reported that the next major storm system was tracking faster than predicted. Satellite imagery showed a massive cloud formation moving northeast from the Bay of Bengal. Current projections put the leading edge of severe weather at their location by 2 p.m., giving them roughly 7 hours to complete a descent that normally took experienced climbers 3 hours. Communication with base camp became a lifeline. Every 30 minutes, Richards provided position updates and requested weather information. The base camp team, led by expedition manager Sarah Chen, coordinated with helicopter pilots in Pokhara, calculating the earliest possible evacuation time and identifying potential landing zones. The helicopter pilots faced their own set of constraints. The aircraft's service ceiling was 7,300 meters in perfect conditions, but performance degraded rapidly with any additional weight, adverse weather, or turbulence. Landing at Camp 3 would require near-perfect conditions and exceptional pilot skill. Technical challenges multiplied with each rope length. The first lowering went smoothly. Kruk remained conscious and could assist by using his feet to push away from the ice face. But by the third pitch, hypothermia was affecting his coordination again. His movements became erratic, and twice he swung into the ice face hard enough to cause additional injuries. Hersey developed a technique for guiding the lower end of each pitch, while Richards managed the anchor systems above. This required precise timing and communication, made difficult by wind noise and the physical demands of working at altitude. Both men were showing signs of exhaustion, fumbling with equipment, making small errors that required correction, and struggling with tasks that would be routine at lower elevations. The Serac bands presented the most dangerous section of the descent. These unstable ice formations could collapse without warning, triggered by temperature changes, vibration, or simply the stress of climbers moving across them. The route threaded between towering ice blocks, some showing obvious signs of recent movement, fresh cracks, tilted angles, and debris fields below. Richards made the decision to move through this section as quickly as possible, accepting higher risk in exchange for reduced exposure time. Instead of careful, methodical lowering, they opted for longer pitches with less secure intermediate protection. Kruk would have to endure longer periods of hanging in his harness, but they would clear the danger zone faster. At 11:30 a.m., they reached the relative safety of 6,800 meters. Kruk's condition had stabilized somewhat. The lower altitude and continued oxygen supplementation were having measurable effects. His core temperature had risen to 34.2 degrees, and his speech was becoming more coherent. But the race against weather was intensifying. Radio reports from base camp painted an increasingly urgent picture. Wind speeds were building faster than forecast, and the first bands of cloud cover were already visible from lower camps. The helicopter appeared as a distant speck against the gray morning sky at 12:47 p.m., still 20 minutes out from Camp 3. Pilot Maurizio Fellini had been flying high-altitude rescues in the Himalayas for 8 years, but Annapurna remained his most challenging destination. At 6,500 meters, his AS-350B3 helicopter was operating near its absolute ceiling. The thin air provided barely enough lift to maintain altitude, let alone maneuver safely near the mountain's steep faces. Every control input had to be precise, too aggressive, and the aircraft would lose lift and drop toward the unforgiving terrain below. The landing zone at Camp 3 consisted of a small, relatively flat area carved into the mountainside. In perfect conditions, it offered just enough space for the helicopter's skids, but conditions were far from perfect. Wind gusts were hitting 45 kilometers per hour from multiple directions as air currents bounced off Annapurna's complex topography. Fellini made 3 approach attempts before committing to the landing. Each time, sudden wind shifts or downdrafts forced him to abort and circle for another try. The fuel gauge showed he had perhaps 10 minutes of hover time remaining before he would be forced to return to lower altitude. On the ground, Richards and Hersey had Kruk prepared for immediate evacuation. They had stripped him of all unnecessary gear, leaving only essential clothing and the oxygen mask that was keeping him stable. Every kilogram mattered. The helicopter was already operating at maximum weight capacity, and even small additions could make the difference between a successful takeoff and a crash. The final approach required split-second timing. Fellini brought the aircraft in fast. using forward momentum to maintain rotor efficiency in the thin air. At the last moment, he flared the helicopter, trading airspeed for lift, and settled onto the improvised landing zone with barely 2 meters of clearance on either side. The loading process took 90 seconds. Richards and Hersey carried Kruk to the aircraft, while Fellini kept the rotors turning. Shutting down and restarting at this altitude would risk engine failure. They secured Kruk in the passenger compartment, connected his oxygen bottle to the aircraft's medical system, and stepped back. Fellini's takeoff was even more dramatic than the landing. The helicopter lifted slowly, struggling for altitude in air that provided minimal lift. For several terrifying seconds, it seemed the aircraft might not clear the ridgeline ahead. But gradually, as Fellini traded altitude for airspeed, the helicopter began climbing toward the relative safety of thicker air below. The flight to Kathmandu took 2 hours and 15 minutes, with one refueling stop in Pokhara. Medical teams at Tribhuvan University Teaching Hospital were standing by when the helicopter touched down. Kruk was rushed into emergency treatment for severe hypothermia, altitude sickness, and dehydration. Richards and Hersey began their own descent to base camp, a journey that would take them another 6 hours through deteriorating weather. By the time they reached safety, both men were showing signs of severe exhaustion and mild altitude sickness. They had been above 6,500 meters for nearly 19 hours, pushing their bodies beyond normal endurance limits.